Welcome everybody to this webinar on leveraging the energy transition for mineral value addition in producer countries. This webinar is co-organized by the Natural Resource Governance Institute and the International Institute for Environment and Development. I'm Audrey Cochran. I'm the director of the Centre for Research on Multinational Corporations, which is usually known by the abbreviation SOMO, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. So this event takes on a key issue for the energy transition. As demand for transition minerals like lithium and nickel skyrockets, many producer countries are asking, can we capture more value at home? And today we'll explore what's shaping their success or limiting their options. And we have four excellent speakers who will look at value addition from a range of perspectives, and I'd like to introduce them to you briefly now. Dr. Aline Alimatusadia is an associate professor at the Faculty of Economics and Business at Universitas Indonesia. Since 2017, she's been the head of the Green Economy and Climate Research Group at the Institute of Economic and Social Research at the university. Dr. Aline is an expert on many dimensions of climate and renewable energy policy, and she will be speaking about Indonesia's experience on its policy to restrict the export of raw nickel and promote domestic processing. Our second speaker is Dennis Gayir, Africa Senior Programme Officer at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, based in their Ghana office. He leads work on data disclosure, data generation, and data advancement. Previously, Dennis was an assistant technical manager at the Secretariat of Ghana's Public Interest and Accountability Committee, PIAC. And Dennis will be speaking about Ghana's lithium refining ambitions. So our first two speakers will focus on country-specific experiences around value addition. Our next two speakers will zoom out and speak about the international dimensions of and issues for mineral value addition. Our third speaker is Will Davis. He's an economic advisor with the Secretariat to the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals and Sustainable Development. He has over 15 years of experience in economic policy advice, including on local content and industrial development along mineral value chains. Previously, Will was a senior economic analyst at NRGI, and he's also worked for the Economist Intelligence Unit and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And Will be talking to us about the highly competitive environment globally that affects mineral value addition. Our final speaker is Dr. Lorenzo Cotula, and he is head of the Law, Economies and Justice Program at the International Institute for Environment and Development. Lorenzo's work focuses on the place of law in strategies to promote fair and sustainable economies, and his expertise cuts across international economic law, natural resource governance, environmental sustainability, human rights, and public accountability. Lorenzo will be speaking about international trade rules and the space for mineral value addition in that context. As you listen to our speakers, please feel free to put comments or questions in the chat, and a colleague from NRGI will be monitoring that, and we'll play those back too and try and get responses from the panel after their interventions. We're also going to have a facility where people can raise their hands if you want to actually speak your question directly. So after the interventions of our panelists, I will facilitate a Q&A session. But let us begin. And we begin at the national level, where success will ultimately be determined. And now I turn to our first speaker, Dr. Aline, to talk to us about the Indonesia experience. Aline, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Audrey, for your nice introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here today. On behalf of LPEM, Universitas Indonesia, I thank the International Institute for Environment and Development for inviting us to join this discussion. I would like to share Indonesia's experience with our nickel downstreaming policy following our recent publication that you can download through our website. We also want to thank NRGI for the collaboration. In my remarks, I would like to extend the value addition aspect not only on economic value, but also on the social and environmental aspect, if I may. But firstly, I would like to give a brief overview of Indonesia's nickel downstreaming history. So Indonesia's history on raw material export began in 2009 when the mining law started to restrict export of raw materials. But the policy was not well implemented until the government reinforced the ban on the export of unprocessed nickel ore to promote domestic smelting industry and refining in 2014. However, the smelting infrastructure was not fully developed at that time. So as a result, the policy actually caused a decrease in nickel production, which affected our trade balance. And to improve our trade balance, the government partially lifted the ban in 2017 by allowing the export of low-grade nickel. But later on, in 2020, Indonesia reinforced again the ban export of nickel ore for the second time. The government strongly motivated companies to build smelters and processing plants within Indonesia, and the goal was to ensure that the value added from the nickel resources happen domestically to boost economic growth and also create local jobs. The strategy also aims to transform Indonesia from a raw material exporter into a key player in the global nickel supply chain. And now the downstreaming policy has become a national strategic program and is viewed as a major driver for growth to reach Indonesia's 8% growth target. So policy are designed to create a red carpet for investors in the nickel industry. Indonesia also established the Indonesia Battery Corporation or IBC, composed of Indonesia's SOEs to strengthen its battery industry. I think it was clear that this policy produced economic gain for Indonesia. If you look in several nickel producing areas, for example, like North Maluku, they experienced strong economic growth after the second nickel export ban. For example, in that province, comparing before and after the second ban, the average growth jumped from only about 6% into 20%. Nickel activities also boost local fiscal revenue. For two nickel-based provinces, local-owned source government revenue increased about 50%. Yeah, the revenue sharing fund or the transfer from the central government to the local government from the mining revenue also growing into like about 7 times. However, yeah, we have also notes here. The claims of job creation remain doubtful. So, for example, in North Maluku, there has been a sharp increase in informal employment in the non-agricultural sector, indicating a labor shift from agriculture to other sectors due to the negative effect of mining and manufacturing. Furthermore, even in the growth uh, in even with the growth in nickel mining, unemployment remains high in this three area. Uh, and we can look also in another aspect of environment. Most of or many nickel mining site overlaps with a forested area. Like for example, more than 300 nickel concession with nearly 70% of the area in forest. And this estimate exclude illegal mining. We also have quite a lot illegal mining, and also most of the nickel mining site areas are in the high biodiversity areas, for example, in the Coral Triangle and other key biodiversity areas. And also the emission, most of our nickel industry use captive coal fire power plants, and also the air quality uh, is increased a lot, yeah, at least about that 3 times compared to the WHO safe limits. On the social costs, yeah, we have quite many unethical and unsafe land acquisition. So the number of reported conflict has increased fivefold, and also the family affected is much more than the case of gold mining site. And also the working condition of the workers in the mining site and industry also, we have a recurring workplace incidents resulting deaths and injuries. So I would like to give some points about what we can do, this pathway for reform. So we believe that many problems happening from the nickel mining and industry happen because the safeguards are not functioning well. I would like to give a key points on what we should do to improve economic, social, and environmental benefit from this nickel mining and industry. For the economy, first is I think Indonesia need to diversify its nickel-based industry, which are mainly used in steel production for now, into higher value products, including EV batteries. So this approach also incorporates more advanced technology. The second one is the nickel-rich local government need to improve how they allocate spending from resource revenue. They should invest the money in expanding productive sectors, compensating affected sectors and also communities, and also preparing for a future post-nickel transition. And the third is Indonesia need to form international partnership with other nickel-rich countries to implement risk mitigation and also to counteract any unfair market practices. In the environmental aspect, the goal is to strengthen sustainable nickel practice. This can be done by carefully assessing the request for an extension period of the mining concession asked by the company, and then also strengthen the ASEA environmental and social impact assessment framework. And also, I think we should also talk with China on green practices within Belt and Road Initiative project. And also, the government, it is quite detailed, but should promote cleaner energy sources for smelters. We should also ban deep sea tailing placement. And the last one related to social dimension, several measures that can be taken includes we should involve the central government and the local government should be involved in resolving conflict. And also we have to enforce implementation of occupational safety and health standard. Lastly, closing the remarks, we believe that future policy should not only focus on maximizing economic gains, but also prioritize better environmental protection and also safeguarding local communities. Because Indonesia's reserve is quite substantial, but we have also limits, yeah. So the government need to implement crucial policy reforms right away before Indonesia faces nickel depletion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aline, and thank you for anchoring us in the multiple dimensions that need to be considered when we're talking about value addition, mineral value addition. It's not just one issue, there's a lot that goes around it, and your remarks are incredibly helpful on that front. I'm going to turn now to Dennis to talk to us about lithium and Ghana. Dennis, over to you.
Thanks very much, Audrey, and thanks everyone for joining. The Ghana experience I would share would take us a bit back to some history around Ghana as a resource producing African country that has been involved in over a century of resource extraction, particularly gold, and largely selling these as raw minerals or limited processing. At the same time, Ghana also has some history of value addition, particularly with its bauxite resources dating back to about 1964, when construction of the first bauxite smelter started and was completed sometime in 1967. And so there's been some degree of success with value addition in other minerals, but not also without substantial challenges. In the 80s and 90s, for instance, the bauxite smelter experienced substantial challenges, including some shutdowns and eventual reopening around 2008, thereabout. And the challenges have mainly been around financial, operational, feedstock. The smelter currently now operates at about 20 to 40% of its capacity of 200,000 and is looking to be retrofitted to about 300,000 capacity. And so basically operating with dated technology, obsolete equipment, and has one of the highest production costs per ton of aluminium globally, and is currently a loss-making entity. And so this is the framework for value addition with particularly a mineral that is considered also a critical mineral. And so quite a bit of history of value addition behind Ghana. And so with the onset of lithium, which the government signed an agreement in October 2023 for the Oya lithium project to take off. There was another experiment of value addition with the lithium project, particularly starting with a requirement in the agreement to ensure that the company, Atlantic Lithium, undertakes a scoping study to establish the viability of a lithium refinery. And so that scoping study, we are told, even though not disclosed, that it's been completed, but the government hasn't, it's been submitted to government, but the government hasn't sort of disclosed the content of it. And so NRGI in Ghana, I'm working together with partners. I try to understand what it would take for Ghana to get into value addition with the lithium find. And generally, mineral value addition, as I indicated, is not new, but the current value addition prospects were changed in a global geopolitics situation that is quite different from what we experienced in 1964, 67, thereabout. China currently dominates the lithium, generally critical mineral value addition. And the West generally wants to break this dominance of Chinese refining. And the key question that usually many Ghanaians will ask is, should a country like Ghana, or even observers would ask, he said, should a country like Ghana be necessarily pursuing value addition for its critical minerals at any cost, in particular, when those prospects are not likely to be profitable? Should we continue to pursue those? And so Ghana is not really the only country that has these plans to add value to its critical minerals. And while many governments and companies have pursued lithium refining in recent years, there's been few success stories from the study that we did, particularly as a result of China's technical expertise and cost advantage within the industry. And so we set out to do an independent analysis of Ghana's lithium value addition ambitions. And the analysis, it was quite unique because it also complemented the refinery analysis with an analysis of the fiscal regime, which we did earlier, just before the lithium value addition analysis. And so the two are complementary, and we'll share those reports as well. The analysis identified several key barriers, generally making the point that at the current moment, it might not be economically viable to add value to Ghana's lithium resources because of a number of factors, in particular, excess refining capacity in China and uncertainty about the growth of lithium chemical demand outside of China would likely limit Ghana's competitiveness. The other challenge really was about limited feedstock. Unless Ghana really discovers other lithium projects besides Ewoya or secures alternative sources, it will not procure adequate feedstock to be able to add value economically. And the lack of industrial capacity generally to produce essential inputs and key chemicals such as sodium carbonates and hydroxides, which are critical for lithium value addition or refining, and the higher cost of capital than many other jurisdictions. In January 2025, for instance, Ghana's risk premium, it was estimated at around 12% compared to between 0 and 1% for countries like Australia, Austria, Canada, Finland, South Korea, and the US. And the high opportunity cost generally, also taking into account some of the environmental and social harms, as Dr. Allen mentioned. In the case of Indonesia, we have similar considerable environmental potential harm that could happen. And all of these factors together, we estimated could cost the government at least some 500 million in lost revenue, as the refinery would need to purchase Ghana's concentrates at below market prices just to be able to break even. And so a refinery, whether built by private investors or as currently envisioned, or even by the state, is unlikely to generate much benefits for Ghanaians. However, the fact that the value addition at the current moment is not viable doesn't really mean that it won't be viable tomorrow. Ghana really should and can plan in the long term for lithium value addition and potentially for other transition minerals as well. The viability and benefits of advancing along a mineral value chain depends on several elements, including the mineral, the stage of the value chain targeted, and then the country context. And so in this context, we really looked at a number of things that Ghana could do, and I'll highlight a few of them just to conclude. Adopting a mine and monitor approach was one of the main ones that we highlighted. Generating current revenues from the lithium mine and investing these revenues sustainably in alignment with this long-term value addition ambition while monitoring global developments. And to guarantee a fair share of revenue flows, government can take advantage of ongoing discussions on the back of requests by Atlantic Lithium for fiscal concessions to reduce its exposure to tax avoidance risks, safeguards its interest, and ensure a fair share of benefits as it engages with the company. And I already mentioned that we did some fiscal regime analysis. In addition to that, we think that grounding Ghana's strategy in economic feasibility, market outlook, and a rigorous cost-benefit analysis would help to provide some clarity that is essential for guiding government's decision-making on the amount of political capital, time to invest, and the money and financial resources that are required, and what trade-offs it should actually accept and which risks to take in attempting to progressively move along the value chain. Ensuring that the refinery replicates tried and tested designs from China is important because that is where the technology really is. And assessing the feasibility and benefits of developing capacity to produce reagents and develop a strategy to use the byproducts to avoid the environmental harm that will be generated as a result of those byproducts if they are not used. And then developing and implementing an industrial policy that is hinged on research and development, building on the industrial and infrastructure base for takeoff in value addition will also be important. And then lastly, the government should be transparent in decision-making and involve citizens every step of the lithium value addition chain. By building trust, we think that the government will improve investment environment and therefore the prospects of lithium value addition in the longer term. Thank you, Audrey.
Many thanks, Dennis. That was great. And I think you bring in China and geopolitics, which obviously looms large in any conversation about mineral value addition in the current context, but also the question of how do we change the calculus about what is economically viable, which is also something I think, Aline, you raised when you talked about moving into EV batteries. So I think that's a nice segue into the next intervention. So I'm going to hand over to Will.
Thank you very much, Audrey. I'm just going to start sharing my presentation. All right. Here we go. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to present findings from research carried out with our friends at NRGI on value addition policies in mineral supply chains. In my remarks, I'm going to show how governments of countries all along mineral supply chains are trying to capture more value locally and why a fairer approach is urgently needed. The key messages in my presentation today are, first, high-income countries and China are deploying substantial fiscal resources towards shifting critical mineral value chains into their territories. These countries are likely to extend their dominance of mineral processing and mineral-based manufacturing, which could harm other developing countries that hope demand for these minerals can spur their industrial development. Some countries, mostly developing ones, but others too, are responding to these moves with trade restrictions to try to localize supply chains. But these trade restrictions only rarely are successful. Instead of a race to win the energy transition with different countries pursuing their own efforts to localize these industries, we think that equitable mineral partnerships would better serve the interests of all. So moving on to the main body of the presentation, let's start with what governments around the world are doing. And this is based on some research that we did looking at a number of data sets on policies in copper, lithium, and nickel supply chains, focusing on the last 5 years. So during that time, we've seen high-income countries like the US, EU members, and Canada and Australia adopt many industrial policies aimed at developing mineral processing and mineral-based manufacturing industries. These countries are using a wide range of different tools to strengthen their positions in mineral value chains. These include direct financial support for their firms, infrastructure, R&D, and skills development spending, and stockpiling minerals to ensure a reliable supply for their own midstream and downstream industries. China, which dominates mineral processing and manufacturing for many minerals, has had these kinds of policies in place for many years. Low and middle income mineral producing countries often lack the financial resources to pursue such approaches. As a result, they rely more on restrictions and penalties, which push the cost of forward linkages or value addition onto the private sector. These policies can include taxes or bans on the export of unprocessed minerals. Licensing conditions that require local processing is another example of this type of policy. But the use of these policies creates a disadvantage for low and middle income countries. While high income countries deploy a full suite of tools, low and middle income ones are typically left with fewer, less effective tools due to their lacking the fiscal resources of the high income countries in China. This graphic shows the disparity, and we've grouped the measures into restrictions and penalties, and then incentives such as tax breaks or subsidies, and finally enablers, things like infrastructure, skills, and R&D. And as you can see, high-income countries on the left tend to use more enablers and incentives, whereas low and middle income countries rely far more on restrictions and penalties. But restrictions and penalties, as I mentioned, are rarely effective. Although, as we've heard from Dr. Aline, there are cases such as Indonesia's ban on the export of unprocessed nickel, where this strategy has worked. These are an exception rather than the general rule. To use export restrictions successfully, countries normally need a high level of market power within the specific value chain. And as we heard from Dr. Aline, it's not just about having an export restriction by itself. Other policies are also needed to encourage the development of the target industry. Otherwise, buyers of the mineral tend to respond to export restrictions by sourcing the mineral from elsewhere, and countries can suffer a reduction in the level of their mineral exports. How should producing countries respond to this situation? One option would be to try harder with restrictions and penalties, to double down, in other words, but as we've seen, this often doesn't work. Another option would be to use scarce public funds to subsidize or encourage mineral value addition. But the tough competitive environment in these value chains means that this might come at too high a cost for developing countries, especially if they're going to have to out-subsidize rich countries in order to domesticate these industries. As a result, in our paper, we propose that governments focus on the key priority industrial development opportunities for their countries, where they have a realistic chance of developing this segment and where it would be worth it for them to do so, i.e. the overall benefits outweigh the costs of what would be needed to encourage this industry to develop. We also recommend that governments recognize that their resources are limited and they can't do everything in terms of pursuing all different types of industrial development under the sun. They need to decide how far mineral-based industrial development is the priority for their country against other uses of public money. For example, even for mineral-producing countries, adding value to minerals does not always represent the best opportunity for industrial development. Agro-processing is a key opportunity for industrial development in some mineral-producing countries, for example. And in some cases, using imported inputs to produce products for the local market can be more viable than adding value to a country's own commodities. This could be the case, for example, for the the assembly of lithium iron phosphate batteries and associated electric vehicles for the local market in Africa, or for the production of wind turbines in Eastern and Southern Africa. In summary, there are perhaps three key questions for governments to decide to focus on when choosing which new industries to develop. First, is it feasible to develop the targeted segment? Second, is it desirable? Is it worth it to develop it given what it would cost? And finally, is it the priority as compared to other opportunities or uses of scarce public resources? So we've talked about what low and middle income countries can do to seize opportunities in mineral value chains. But what about what richer countries are already doing? Well, richer countries' efforts to attract mineral-based industries to their territories that we've just discussed risk distorting the global economy at the expense of lower-income countries. Some might argue that these policies are good for the climate because they accelerate the energy transition in some of the world's most polluting countries. But the specific approach taken with these policies is undesirable. This is because it tends to lead richer countries to dominate mineral value chains, when they could instead promote the purchase of renewable energy technologies, along with R&D that would allow a technology to advance and be manufactured wherever it's most efficient to produce these products. And though richer countries argue that they need to diversify their supply chains and promote security of mineral supply for the energy transition, they can achieve this just as well by promoting value addition in mining countries. In fact, increased value addition in mining countries is likely to reduce supply disruptions by reinforcing the social license for mining companies to operate, which is closely tied to the economic impacts of mining in host countries. Moreover, producing countries often power their industries with cleaner energy than either the industrial powerhouses that currently dominate mineral value chains or the rich countries that are trying to do so. This is another reason why greater value addition in mining countries can be good for the climate. That's why in the paper, we argue that instead of a competition to domesticate mineral-based industries, we need equitable mineral partnerships that support mineral-producing countries' aspirations to add value to their minerals, where this is in line with their priorities and economic circumstances. While many mineral partnerships have already been signed, they often lack transparency or details on how they're going to contribute to local value addition. So it's unclear whether they will be able to meet this aim. To conclude, I'm going to recap the key messages that I went through at the beginning of the presentation. First, high-income countries and China are deploying substantial fiscal resources towards shifting critical mineral value chains into their territories. These countries are likely to extend their dominance of mineral processing and mineral-based manufacturing as a result, which could harm developing countries that hope to develop their own mineral-based industries. Some countries, mostly developing ones, but others too, are responding with trade restrictions to try to localize supply chains, but these policies only rarely work. And finally, instead of a race to win the energy transition by localizing industries, we think that equitable mineral partnerships would better serve the interests of all. Thank you very much, and looking forward to our discussion.
Many thanks, Will. And I think you've raised some of the core questions and the difficult ones to answer, equitable partnerships and just what are the incentives, but I'm sure this will come up in the Q&A afterwards. Before I hand over to Lorenzo, I just want to remind people, we will be able to take you putting your hand up to speak your question after the four panelists have finished, but you can also put your questions in the Q&A box at the end of your screen. So you should see something that has a question mark and a Q&A box. You can put questions there. There are also a couple of questions in the chat, which we'll also capture, but if you can try and put them in the Q&A box, or we'll take a hands up at the end of the interventions. But now I'm going to hand over to Lorenzo.
Thank you very much, Audrey, and thank you all for participating in this conversation. My contribution today will focus on the international policy dimensions, especially those related to trade and investment agreements. And I will do so drawing on new research that's been released this week. I will share the web links in the chat. These dimensions are important because national policy operates not in isolation, but within an international economic governance system, which affects options available to policymakers. A key issue then is that national policy efforts to promote domestic value addition need to be accompanied by initiatives that can also ask questions about and rethink international arrangements. So what are these arrangements? There are, first of all, a number of multilateral instruments, particularly on trade, centered around the system of the World Trade Organization. The relevance of this system is illustrated by the case of export restrictions, which has come up already in several contributions today. Many low and middle income mineral producing countries have adopted export restrictions, restrictions on the export of raw materials in order to promote value addition locally. And as Will already mentioned, these type of measures might appeal to some governments in low and middle income countries, partly because, unlike subsidy programs, they do not require extensive public resources. And this consideration may be particularly relevant in countries that are already dealing with debt problems. Now, with a few exceptions, WTO rules prohibit quantitative export restrictions, and these rules have already been invoked to challenge certain domestic value addition policies, including via actual legal proceedings. A WTO panel established upon request by the EU found that the measures that Indonesia adopted to restrict the export of unprocessed nickel, which Dr. Lin mentioned earlier, were inconsistent with WTO rules. So there is a multilateral system, but there are also bilateral and regional agreements, including agreements that have been negotiated or are being negotiated in connection with the energy transition. In the context of global geopolitical rivalries, we have seen the negotiation of bilateral strategic partnerships that are specifically centered on access to critical minerals. The EU has been very active in this space and has signed MOUs with Chile, Zambia, the DRC, Rwanda, Namibia, Kazakhstan, and so on. Now, the wording of these MOUs varies, but essentially these are soft instruments. They are not legally binding. And they envisage the development of a roadmap and ongoing dialogue to promote closer integration in mineral supplies. Some of these MOUs do refer to local value addition, for example, in the way they define their objectives, their scope, the principles for the partnership. But one of the questions then about this arrangement is, what difference will this roadmap and dialogue approach make in practice? How will things really pan out in practice, including as regards international collaboration to promote domestic processing? Meanwhile, we have seen the negotiation of bilateral and regional trade and investment agreements that provide detailed, legally binding rules that are backed by international dispute settlement mechanisms. Now, these rules go beyond WTO requirements, and they can even more significantly affect policy options for governments as they seek to promote local value addition. To mention a few examples, bilateral and regional trade agreements often prohibit not just quantitative export restrictions, as in WTO rules, but also export duties. So there's a wider range of types of export restrictions that are prohibited. And also many investment agreements and trade agreements also prohibit performance requirements, such as that mandate businesses to export a given percentage of goods or services, or to accord priority to domestic goods and services, or to transfer certain types of technologies. On top of all this, some recent EU trade treaties also contain devoted energy and raw materials chapters. This is the case, for example, of the modernized Chile-EU trade agreement, which was concluded in 2023. The chapter prohibits forms of indirect export restrictions, such as in the form of export monopolies, measures that set a higher price for exports than for domestically marketed products. Now, a government might wish to differentiate pricing for imports and exports as a way to supply domestic processors with cheaper raw materials, as a way to stimulate the local industry. This particular treaty between the EU and Chile contains some important caveats in relation to that particular provision. Overall, however, taken together, these type of provisions can place significant constraints on the policy options that are available to governments as they seek to promote domestic value addition. Now, why does this matter? In a sense, we're seeing the impaired functioning at the WTO, which means that implementation of WTO rulings is now more uncertain. We are seeing, in a changing global context, that many large economies have signaled the new preparedness to depart from established trade rules. And we see that in the news every day. But the issue is that for developing countries, particularly those that the United Nations classifies as least developed countries, LDCs, it may be harder to adopt and sustain measures in open breach of international agreements on trade and investment, particularly in the face of unilateral enforcement actions from larger economies or potentially from legal claims from international investors and so on. So the normative content of the treaties does matter because they do set restrictions or parameters with legal bite. So to conclude, when discussing options, when discussing policies, approaches, the desirability and different ways to promote value addition, we need to look not just at domestic policies, what approaches work where, under what conditions, and so on, but also we need to look at the international policy instruments to ensure that these are supportive of value addition goals. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Lorenzo. That was excellent and really helps to move us from Will talking about the unequal playing field to the unequal playing field is backed by some fairly tough rules, and how do we get around that? So the floor is now open for questions. We have some questions in, so I'm going to start with some of the ones that have come in, but if you want to put up your hand to speak, please do so and we'll let you speak. Otherwise, please continue to put questions in the Q&A box or the chat. But I'm going to throw out a few questions together just because I'm conscious we've got about a little less than 20 minutes for this segment of the webinar. So I'll put a few questions out together and then ask the four panelists to reflect on those elements that they feel they want to make a contribution on. So we've had questions from Dolores, David, and Isaac. One is, I mean, overall, a key area of questioning that we're seeing is how can we leverage the current context to change some of the calculus on what's possible for producer countries? Because as panelists have said, there are some significant challenges and some significant risks. So how can we use this moment in time to change the calculus? We've got a question, how can equitable partnerships be forged when countries align their energy transition policies with their national interests, which is an extension of the same point? So how do we deal with the fact that everyone's operating from national self-interest? In the context of the current geopolitics, there's also a question on what role do transportation structures in the supply chain of minerals play, such as ports and so on, in the value addition efforts of countries in the global south in general. So the whole transportation structure and system, how does that affect the whole question? And then there's a more specific one on how can countries like Ghana benefit from the experiences of Indonesia and other resource-rich countries in their governance and management of critical minerals. So how can countries learn from each other, benefit from each other's experience? So I'll start with those questions, and I'm going to go backwards and ask Lorenzo, do you want to come in on any of those?
Yes, thank you, Audrey. Excellent questions, and I'll be happy to start and then keen to hear from other speakers. I think there's a question there about the overall climate in the geopolitical context that we're seeing, whereby each government essentially is pursuing their own national interests, and how is it possible to promote equitable partnerships in this context? I think that's a very important question. As Will very eloquently put it, there is a strong case, for governments not to go down that sort of individual route or sort of that race to control the value chain route, but rather to work collaboratively and in partnership. And I think part of the answer lies in the fact that ultimately the national interest of multiple parties is best addressed, is best pursued in a sustainable way through that equitable partnership approach. I spoke primarily about the trade and investment agreements just now, but there are also other international arrangements that we would like to discuss more in policy spaces, such as, for example, the international arrangements that facilitate the development of large-scale infrastructure to move goods, to move critical raw materials, for example, from producer countries to consumer countries. We just published a briefing note on the Lobito corridor. And a key message there is that ultimately, even from the point of view of the prospective importers of those materials, there is an interest in ensuring the long-term viability, long-term sustainability of the arrangement. And for that to happen, there needs to be a response to the policy aspirations and the policy efforts that the governments, in that case of Zambia, the DRC, and Angola, are pursuing in order to export not just raw materials, but to actually export a degree of processing involved with that. And as we'll mention also, the processing is not just necessarily in the critical mineral sector, but it's also in adjacent sector, in other sector, also from a point of view of economic diversification. So looking at the agriculture sector, the whole food demand that can be expected to be fostered by workers coming in and working, for example, on the development of transport infrastructure. So looking at national interest in the long term, meaning that it goes via partnerships more than seeking to benefit the most and use sort of economic strength to pull that in a direction. There are maybe a couple of other questions I'd like to pick up, but I'm mindful that I spoke a lot. And so I'll pause and I'll come back to some of the other questions later if possible, please.
Great, thanks very much, Lorenzo. Can I maybe pass it over to Dr. Aline to answer any of those questions, particularly how can countries learn from Indonesia's experience, but also how can we look at how to leverage this particular context we're in, where countries desperately need these minerals? How can producer countries leverage this context to change a dynamic on value addition that we've seen maybe in previous mineral boom cycles not result in what producer countries really want?
Yeah. Maybe I will respond to this question in a broader aspect. Yeah. First, what we need to remember is the period of nickel in Indonesia is actually very short. It will last for about like 10 to 15 years from now. So I think our strategy in managing this resource and capturing this domestic value addition is very important. So we need also to think about post-nickel economy, yeah, and how the benefit that we get in the nickel period can also smooth our development in post-nickel, in particularly in the nickel base region. So this is the first one, and the second one is I think we need to utilize the market power that we get. I agree with Will, yeah, about the why Indonesia we have successfully, have this effective measures for nickel. I don't think it is replicable for other mining commodities in Indonesia, because actually in our roadmap strategy for downstreaming for other commodities, yeah, we have I think more than 20 other mineral commodities, but I don't think it is replicable, because in nickel we have about 20 or a fifth of world nickel reserve. Yeah, I think we are now the largest exporter of nickel, something like that. So we need to play very carefully and nicely in having this market power. For example, like we experience a price decrease in nickel because we give a lot of quota, to nickel producer. I think we need also to look at how much we should produce and something like that to optimize the price and also the benefit from this. And then the third one is how to govern the benefit. I think the role of tax is very important. So, but the problem with this nickel, because we give many incentive to the nickel mining and industry, I don't think we optimize the revenue from the nickel itself. If we want to give the incentive, I think it is more proper to the nickel industry, but not on the nickel mining. Because in the nickel mining, we can get a lot of resource rent from that. And then this is the source of revenue that the government can redistribute and also invest in something that, we can smooth the post-mining period. Yeah, I think the role of tax is very important to smooth this intertemporal development. And related to the dynamic or intertemporal policy also, I don't think that, so we have to know how long the restriction should be last. It shouldn't be permanent, yeah, because we need to think about our competitiveness. So we should have the target, and yeah, to leverage also our commodity outside nickel. Yeah, I think that's all from me. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Elaine. Can I hand over to Dennis for any reflections on those first batch of questions?
Yes, I'll reflect on two questions. What Ghana could learn from the Indonesian experience, and then maybe the nationalization and as compared to mineral resource partnerships. On the lessons, I think that Dr. Elaine really mentioned some of the issues that cannot be compared. I mean, every mineral is unique in its own way. The reserve potential of Indonesia in nickel is not the same as the lithium reserves in Ghana. And so for me, value addition should look at the potential to be able to secure feedstock, because that's important in terms of value addition. Given that every country wants to add value. And so for me, Ghana can focus on developing, exploring more to build up its reserve and feedstock potential if it wants to proceed with lithium value addition. But also look at minerals like bauxite, where it has some potential, I mean, substantial volumes available, and where it has experimented and learned some lessons over the years would be important. I think in the Indonesian experience, you can learn from both good and bad. I think export bans may not necessarily be the way to go for Ghana, especially for minerals like lithium, where you don't really have the reserve potential already, and having secured the right basis in terms of infrastructure, in terms of inputs to be able to add value. An import ban or export ban in those minerals would yield very little results. But I think we can learn from the investment attractiveness of Indonesia, and then the local capacity development to pursue value addition in nickel. I think those are important lessons that we can learn from Indonesia. On the question of each country focusing on its energy transition policies and wanting to strike partnerships, I think they are not mutually exclusive. Even in designing partnerships, you need to consider what your strategic position is, and that for me is national interest. Countries must go into these partnership negotiations with a clear view of what is required to help them leapfrog and accelerate their value addition prospects in the context of the global race to add value by different countries. And so if you have the resource and you are the resource owner, I think building that internal capacity to be able to add value increases your leverage to be able to do a strategic partnership. And for me, the two can work together if we do the right set of analysis, market act as assessment to be able to determine what is feasible and what is not feasible before we go into negotiations with partners.
Great, thanks a million, Dennis. Will, do you have any reflections on that? And then if you could be brief, then I'll try and get a second round of questions, and I'm not sure we'll get to everyone's questions, but Will, have you any reflections on the first set of questions?
Thanks, Audrey. Just one question I'd like to respond to, which is the one about the prospects for equitable partnerships in a world driven by national interest. I would argue, as we do in our paper, that it is in high-income countries' own enlightened self-interest to pursue an equitable approach. As I mentioned in my presentation, it's arguably better for the climate, which affects us all, to encourage downstream and midstream value addition in mineral producing countries. But also I think that a dose of realism is needed for the policymakers in the high-income countries. They can't do it all either. And in fact, there's all of this discourse about how, for energy security and so on, they need to secure these sort of supplies, but very little that analyzes the trade-off between that and the cost of getting these minerals. In many cases, it may be more affordable for them to source processed minerals from producing countries than trying to do it themselves. In large part because when you remove impurities in the processing in the mineral producing country, it cuts the cost of transporting those minerals. So yeah, I think that it's in high-income countries' own self-interest to not try to monopolize the midstream and downstream segments of these value chains. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Will. We are running out of time, but I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple more questions because I really appreciate everybody's been asking good questions. So this one, Will, is back to you. Is there a case to be made for different responses to different kind of trade and investment restrictions? So with export bans being on one end of the spectrum, what else can we do? And that's a question from Sunayana. And then Wendy asks something that I'm going to give to Dr. Alin, which is, what are the options or indications for countries essentially forming coalitions or partnerships to resist the way some of the wealthy high-income countries are acting in the current geopolitical context? And you had actually mentioned that in relation to nickel production. So can I put those two questions on the table before we wrap up? And apologies that there isn't more time to dive into all of what's on the table. But Will, can I go to you first and then Alin to you next? And if you can keep it brief because we've only got a couple of minutes.
Absolutely. On Sunayana's question, thanks very much. So I understand that there are far fewer disciplines on export taxes under WTO law than on quantitative restrictions. That's one option. And I think something that I particularly like about the export tax option is that countries can make it low risk by putting in place an export tax and at the same time reassessing their overall fiscal framework for mining. Why is this low risk? Because it means that they're less at risk of driving away investment in the mining industry. If they make sure that even when they introduce the export tax, the overall fiscal framework is still manageable for investors in the mining industry. It would basically be equivalent to giving a tax incentive for local processing. But depending on how it affects the risks of tax avoidance, an export tax and then an overall reduction in the burden of other taxes might be more appropriate. On the question about forming coalitions, I think that this is an interesting idea, but we need to look at the experience of commodity-based cartels that existed in the 1970s and largely collapsed because they weren't able to maintain discipline among their members. The only one that has survived since that time, to my knowledge, is OPEC. OPEC has survived because of its flexible structure, in that all of the members vote every time on the level of production that they're going to pursue. Which means that when countries don't stick to a target, as they invariably don't, the whole thing does not collapse in acrimony because it allows them to discuss every time what they want to do. But I think that it's, as I mentioned in my presentation, because of the role of these minerals in climate mitigation, which is in everybody's interests. It's better if we can have a collaborative rather than confrontational approach. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Will. And knowing that we're really tight on time, but I'd like to give the last word to Dr. Alin on what do you think about collaboration between countries? And you specifically mentioned that on nickel. So if you could give us a short soundbite on that one, Alin.
Yeah, maybe just several addition from what has been said by Will. Maybe I'm more interested to suggest a form of collaboration in how we should manage, how should we manage this commodities, yeah, in terms of sustainability. So I think it should be many stakeholders discuss these things, not only the producing countries, but also countries who demands the commodity, and then how to manage a fair game in terms of now many countries think about themselves, think about how to create value addition domestically, and how to we can discuss actually how to make the equitable, domestic value addition across countries, across countries. Yeah, I think that's all. And I also agree completely with Will about the export tax. Maybe it is better than export ban. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, we have run out of time. I think we could have gone on for another hour because there are really great questions there, and I think an awful lot to unpack. But moving away from narrow self-interest and short-term views to long-term collaboration, collaborative approaches seems to be a dominant theme. I would like to thank everybody who joined the webinar. Apologies to those who had questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, but thank you so much for your participation, and amazing thanks to the 4 excellent speakers that we had. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day wherever you are.